Hello and welcome to the Modern Adventurer podcast, where explorers and adventurers tell their stories. Coming up.
When I had my accident, I had almost this kind of like bank of resilience that I could start tapping into, and trust me, I needed to tap into it. I think had I not gone through those life experiences in the build up to my accident and tested myself and pushed my limits and, pushed myself out of my comfort zone and grown as an individual, that whole growth mindset kind of stuff. If I'd then gone through what I'd gone through and had to overcome a new type of adversity and life's biggest challenge, and this is a challenge that, climbing a mountain or going through, selection with a Special Forces Reserve, you could quit at any point. You could turn back around the mountain, or you could just say, you know what, I'm voluntary withdrawing, I don't want this enough kind of thing. Whereas with this challenge, with a life-changing injury, there's no get out clause, there's no give up clause. You just have to attack it and you have to keep moving forward.
My next guest is an adventurer and disabled speaker.
Thanks for having me, John.
Oh, it's an absolute pleasure. I think you've got an incredible story to tell on the podcast today, and one that I sort of feel, I think probably it's best just to jump straight into it and just start right at the beginning about how this love of adventure came about and what are you doing, because I know that you were training to become like this Army Reserve, training for the SAS, having these huge plans, and then something dramatic happened that changed the course of your life.
Yeah. I guess for me, I almost feel like there's two clear chapters to my life. There's a crux where things really change and life changes quite dramatically pretty damn quickly. And the person that I am is still the same. Someone said to me that a life-changing injury strips away your sense of identity and who you are as a person. At the time, I worried that was true. I was worried that I was about to lose who I was as a person. But I was always adamant that I wouldn't change. And at my heart, I would always be the same version of me, perhaps in a different way. So, growing up, I felt like a little bit of a misfit. I was in a friendship group which was interested in football and drinking and girls. And while I liked football and girls, I was never much of a drinker. And it wasn't until I was 17 that I met someone who became my best friend who, came from an adventurous lifestyle and was someone that climbed and wanted to be a mountaineer and was moving in that direction in his life. And he really pulled me in that direction as well. He gave me a taste of what it was like to live more adventurously and to not live for the pub and the football pitch and for the girls, whilst the latter still remains an interest, obviously. And all of a sudden we live up in Shrewsbury in the West Midlands. We're about an hour and a half from Snowdonia. So my first indoctrination into this world was going up Cribgoch, Snowdon, and just having this real revelation of this is the sort of person, the sort of lifestyle I want to lead and the thing that I want to make me as a person. So for what would have been 9 years, I developed my skill set and my interest and my love for climbing and for mountaineering, moving from just hiking at the start through to traditional rock climbing, sport climbing in the Alps. Had the absolute honour and privilege of climbing Mont Blanc in 2014 and going back to climb Monte Rosa, which is the second highest, in 2015. And life was moving in one direction and there were two clear goals of mine. The first of mine was to climb in the Himalayas. And I probably apologise for the mispronunciation of this, but making plans to go to climb Choyo in 2000 and what would have been 17. And like you alluded to, I was part of the Army Reserve, and I was going through the selection and training process for the SAS Reserve. And I was 2 years into that. I'd gone through the physical selection process, which is known as HILS, which is just physical torture over the mountains of South Wales and the Brecon Beacons, just pushing yourself beyond what you think your limits are and pushing yourself so far out of your comfort zone you wouldn't know how to find it if someone turned you around and said to go back to it. And that was it. My purpose in life, my drive in life, and my passion were to achieve these two goals that had the same elements to them. They were both extremely challenging and extremely rewarding. And then life changed pretty dramatically in an unexpected way when I was rock climbing in North Wales, so probably about an hour from me in a place called Llangollen, in an old limestone quarry. So really sketchy would probably be the best word to describe it. It's a real loose rock. And the slight irony of where I had my accident is the crag itself is called World's End. Little did I know that day it potentially would kind of represent the end of my particular world at the moment. So it was the 6th of August 2016. I was climbing with the person that introduced me to this world 9 years earlier, with Matt, and we're kind of at the final pitch of what is a 120-foot rock face, and I make the final ascent, and I'm putting my gear in as I go, and I'm stood at the top of this 30-foot section, and I've made it. As far as I'm concerned, done. Matt's going to come up to me and we're going to walk off and go home. The final sort of pitch was a little bit tricky, and Matt was struggling to get up it, and we were conscious that he was going on a date that night, with a first date with a girl from Tinder, and she kind of like ticked all his boxes, so he was super keen. He was like, right, come on, we got to go. So I think he was getting a little bit frustrated. He couldn't make it up to me. So the quickest thing in our heads was for me to quickly rig up an abseil and go back down to him, walk off this kind of like middle ledge together and back to the car, which is parked down the bottom. And it was kind of when we were doing that, I was going through the motions of setting up my anchor point and abseiling back down to him, that as I looked down, and it's the sort of thing that you probably do hundreds of thousands of times before, anybody listening that's, a climber or a mountaineer, you stand on the edge and you're confident and comfortable standing there. But it was as I was kind of peering over my shoulder and saying something back down to Matt that was more than likely about the date that night, and I'm pretty sure it was. I think the word catfish might have been used. I was like, it's going to be a catfish. And it was the last thing that I'd say to Matt. And before I know it, the ledge that I was on shifted below my feet and I froze. I completely froze. And within seconds, probably a millisecond, my rope started to zip through my belay device, my abseil device. And it was like, being on a roller coaster ride at a theme park where you get that initial drop and you kind of get that pit of the stomach feeling, but it just kept going. And before I know it, I'm falling straight back down what could have been a 100-foot drop. But fortunately for me, what probably lasted 3 or 4 seconds felt like an eternity. And in that moment, I knew I had such kind of like crystal awareness of everything that I stood to lose. And the kind of the nature of the first time in my life I was completely out of control of what was about to happen to me. And that was genuinely really scary because I didn't know what was going to happen in the next couple of seconds. I land flat on my back on the ledge that Matt is stood on, which is probably no more than 6 foot wide, and I start to tumble. So I've landed on my back. At that point, I've broken my back. I don't know it at the time. I know that I'm in pain. I start to tumble. I tumble through like a thorn bush. So I've got a scar that runs probably from my wrist all the way up to my shoulder. So that was kind of insult to injury at that point. And I don't know it, but as I'm tumbling and I'm about to tumble off this next sort of 40-foot section, Matt has seen me land, has sprinted over to me and has rugby tackled me, and he's rugby tackled me on the edge of this next ledge. So without a doubt, at that point, he's saved my life and stopped me from falling any further. And yeah, it's kind of those initial seconds of confusion and panic and kind of trying to come to terms on understanding of what's just happened. And probably on that ledge for about an hour before the mountain rescue team turn up and the situation starts to be assessed. Matt's kind of got me stable, and it was in that timeline before mountain rescue turned up that I tried to stand up for the first time, and it felt like the whole world had kind of like pivoted in the middle of my back. The top half of my body, the top half from my chest up, had moved as if it was to stand up, and it was in that moment that I had this real dawning realization that I couldn't feel my legs and that my brain simply didn't know that 3/4 of my body existed. And I think in that moment, I realized that I was seriously injured. Until that point, the pain that I was feeling was from my arm, from ripping my arm as I fell. So my main concern was the fact that I'd broken my arm or that I'd seriously injured my arm. I didn't really think about the fact that I might have injured my spine or had a spinal injury. And we put that initial 30, 45 minute period down to shock, and kind of it would wear off and I'd stand up and we'd think no more of it. And yeah, probably two hours elapsed by the time the Coast Guard helicopter's there. So obviously we can't use a normal air ambulance just because of the exposure of the cliff. And that kind of starts a 5-month journey for me through intensive care, being told the next day by surgeons and the guy that operated on me when I arrived at the major trauma unit as to what I'd done, as to kind of the level of my injury and the severity of my injury, and the very no shit talking assessment of my sort of prognosis was that the level of damage, I'd broken my back at T6, which is kind of where your breastbone meets in the middle, and I'd not just really broken my back. I'd without being too graphic, I'd snapped my back clean in two. As I'd landed on a piece of metal hex, one of my climbing nuts. So the force of the impact had been times by 10 at that point, and I'd completely dislodged my spine. My spinal cord was severely injured, and that's the thing. There's breaking your back and not affecting your spinal cord. Some people can, and I've met people in hospital that came in paralysed from the neck down, and over the course of 6 to 12 weeks, they rediscover the ability to walk because the swelling on their spinal cord reduces. But for me, it was such a cold-hearted prognosis of, we're sorry, but this is it. We'll know more, but this is you for the time being.
Wow. And the sort of rehabilitation of it. I mean, your partner that you were climbing with, because did you fall? You fell next to him. I thought you might have fallen on him. Did you fall on him?
No, so I fell probably, I think, a couple of feet, 6 foot to the left of him.
Okay.
Yeah. And
then he grabbed you just before you could fall off again.
So I gave him and that's something that I've always remembered, is as I was falling, I had enough time to shout his name, I think 4 times, because I was physically letting him know what was happening, because he would have had no idea. As far as he was concerned, I'd set up myself to come back down to him, to take my gear out as I was going, and that was it. So had he still been clipped into the rock at that point, which he was, he would have seen me land, and unless he'd unclipped quick enough, he never would have made it to me, because we're talking seconds between me landing and me going off that next ledge.
And I suppose for people listening, it's the mental strain of coming to terms with your situation. How was it in a sense of having all these goals and aspirations to suddenly being told by the doctor, no more?
Yeah. It was really tough. Being honest, I think that first week in intensive care was such a blur. I was kind of like hooked up to a machine where if I was in pain, I could hit this red button and I'd get a hit of morphine. So that first week, and coming off the back of what was I think like a 9-hour surgery, was really taxing, on me physically and emotionally. And I really struggled in intensive care, being in an environment where you feel so claustrophobic, surrounded by beeping machines, surrounded by people that were going through horrific injury, people screaming. And all of a sudden, there were no windows. It was only aircon. My body was overheating from trying to recover from surgery. And it wasn't until I think that day 4 where the staff, and I think my mum in particular, noticed that I was really beginning to struggle emotionally, that they wheeled me out of intensive care into like the ambulance bay that was just like down the corridor, just to get fresh air and sunlight and just to breathe for the first time since my accident, and just to kind of like get a few deep breaths in and kind of reaffirm to myself that I can handle this. And that was one of the key promises I made myself on the day of my accident, when we waited for the Coast Guard helicopter to turn up, which was my kind of rescue, was that I promised whatever this was, because I didn't know at that point, whatever this is, I won't let it beat me. And I really almost gave up on that by day 4 of intensive care, because I was finding it so hard. And being wheeled out into that ambulance bay was that kind of moment where I could reaffirm to myself that commitment and just say, you know what, you do have this. I just needed that kind of moment of fresh air, sunlight on my skin, just to really take stock and say to myself, you do have this. You know, you weren't naive to promise it. But it was really tough to be told that I'd have to give up on 2 key dreams and a way of living that I'd built over a 9-year kind of love affair with being outdoors and adventurous was tough. But at the same time, I just knew that I'd find a new way of living that life. It wasn't that I was going to change as a person. It's just that the mode of transport might change was the only thing that I thought in my head.
I have a friend who had a friend was sort of blown up. And I suppose at the start, when you come to terms with the situation, you sort of set yourself goals and you sort of use that as your focus and your drive each day. Did you sort of have that? Was the idea of like when you're in hospital, you're like, right, I'm going to attempt to try and do this or attempt to do that. And then that's your focus. And then your goal and each day is to try and progress to this level. Whether it's so minor, you know, like a sort of, I don't know, being able to feel your toe or, you know, being able to take one step, those sort of goals are in your sort of head to sort of push you forward. Was that a similar thing that happened to you when you were in hospital?
Yeah, for sure. So they said that the first 6 weeks could you know, things could come back and you might rediscover some feelings. So I was kind of really hypersensitive to if I woke up, could I feel anything? Could I try and wiggle my toes? And then I kind of thought, well, you know what, let's focus on what I can control. So I'm pretty sure I was one of the first people to ask for some weights. I was on, so you kind of go into bed rest. So you're on like a 6-week bed rest program. And when I say bed rest, I mean you are in bed, flat on your back, and you're giving yourself a 6-week kind of period to heal. And I found that so frustrating because whilst there was like TV there was all the kind of like, you know, gadgets to keep you occupied. Physically, it was so hard just to sit or to lay still. So I kind of, one day I said to the physio, I was like, do you reckon I can get some weights? And she was like, Darren, you probably misinterpreted the idea of bed rest here, but the idea of bed rest is that you rest. And I was like, yeah, but I need to do something. I'm wasting away. And I was wasting away. I was in the physical shape of my life and was watching my body kind of like evaporate rapidly. And so she kind of said, well, I'll see what I can do. And she came back in one day with a pink 1 kilo dumbbell, or 2 of them to be precise, and was like, this is the best we can do. And I kind of like very gratefully took them. And I was like, okay, perfect. So when she left, I started trying to do like chest press and like, you know, some curls, whatever I could do from my like laying down position. And the next day I was like, Amy, I'm so sorry, but is there anything heavier than 1 kilo? And she kind of said that she was bending the rules, but she gave me a 2 kilo dumbbell, and the same thing. You could chuck this thing across the room without much trying. So one of my friends works at a gym in the town near me, and I said to him, I was like, mate, I'm dying here. Come on, I need something. So he kind of goes away and gets me a 4 kilo dumbbell from his gym, and to this day, there's still a 4 kilo. This is 5 years later. There's still a 4 kilo dumbbell that's left to kind of like spare. There's one missing, and I've got it. And so I kind of started to try and do what I could physically to rehabilitate myself. There was a device that when if I have it. There was a device when I first got to hospital, which was it was to measure lung function. So as I'd landed, I'd broken 3 ribs on my back and I'd punctured my lung. So my breathing was really laboured and my breathing was pretty weak. So there's a little chambered thing. It's 3 balls in different chambers, and you have to inhale. And a healthy person, without trying, me or you now, could inhale and all three would lift. And that would be kind of like piece of cake, really. I was so weak, from a cardiovascular point of view when I got in, that I could just about wobble this first ball. And I was trying with all my kind of strength to do it. And I couldn't. So every day I was like, a bit like a blooming drug addict. I was like either doing these weights or, I'll say this very carefully, sucking this pipe to try and lift these balls. And day by day, that first ball got higher up the chamber until it reached the top. A couple of days later, I'd be wobbling the second ball, first ball would be at the top, wobbling the second ball. And it was these little wins and these little kind of goals, like you say, that kept me in a positive state of mind, because I was seeing progress, even though I was still laying in bed. And I was counting down the days of, however many days left until I could get up for the first day. It was a long 6 weeks of lying flat and trying to find those little goals just to keep my mindset ticking along.
I think that's probably really important, because I think you can almost go one of two ways. You could almost give up and say, my life's over, or you could set yourself goals and try and go out and pursue them. And I imagine for people who have these sort of life-changing injuries, you go of one of two ways. But I always was told that it's after 3 months, once it's all, the goals have sort of been set and done, and you sort of have to move back into normal society or normal life. That's where it becomes the most challenging. Yeah.
So there's an expression that they say in hospital. So you're on the spinal ward for 5 months, all in all. They say that you're going from the zoo to the jungle. So the hospital is the zoo, because you're fed, you're watered, you're looked after, you're medicated. If anything goes wrong, don't worry. You're taken care of. Then you're discharged into the jungle, because you're having to fend for yourself. To a large extent, you have to fend for yourself. You're going back into a world that you're looking at it from a different perspective. You've never seen the world like you do before. I'm used to walking around 6 foot, see a mountain, run up it, see a cliff, climb it, and you go out at 4'3", sat down, and all of a sudden, going off a curb, which is 6 inches, or going up a curb, which is 6 inches, become your new little mini Everest that you kind of, day by day, you're like, right, well, if I'm going to fall, and trust me, I have fallen out and embarrassed myself in public so many times by just trying to do something a bit stupid, but all very mundane, and falling out my chair, and yeah, so that was scary, and I'd gone through, my long-term relationship and broke up in hospital. And all of these little things were challenging my resilience and challenging my ability to stay resilient. And it was, I think, having the saving grace for me at that point was the fact that in the 9 years in the build up to my injury, I'd gone through tests and challenges, and I'd failed and overcome failure and learnt from failure, that when I had my accident, I had almost this kind of bank of resilience that I could start tapping into. And trust me, I needed to tap into it. I think had I not gone through those life experiences in the build up to my accident and tested myself and pushed my limits and, pushed myself out of my comfort zone and grown as an individual, that whole growth mindset kind of stuff. If I'd then gone through what I'd gone through and had to overcome a new type of adversity and life's biggest challenge, and this is a challenge that, climbing a mountain or going through, selection with a Special Forces Reserve, you could quit at any point. You could turn back around the mountain, or you could just say, you know what, I'm voluntary withdrawing. I don't want this enough, kind of thing. Whereas with this challenge, with a life-changing injury, there's no get out clause. There's no give up clause. You just have to attack it, and you have to keep moving forward. So leaving hospital was scary. It was scary, really scary, because I didn't quite know what my life was going to look like. But there was one really important thing I did in hospital that I think got a lot of eye rolls at the time, was I had a day off, a bit like a prisoner. I had day release for 1 day, and me, Matt, and another of our friends, Harry, went up to Manchester, which is about an hour, and we went to a kayak shop And in my head, I was like, kayaking is the way that I'm going to live the same lifestyle, and a way for me to not feel like I'm disabled or not feel like I've got a life-changing injury. So we went up, spent, I think, 800 quid on a kayak and 200 quid more and all the bits to go with it. You know, I'd saved a bit of money being in hospital, obviously, and came back the next day triumphant. Came back the same day, and I saw my physio the next day. And I just asked her the simple question. I was like, do you think I could kayak? And she was like, what? And I was like, in your opinion, can someone of my injury level, you know, someone who's chest down, paralysed, could they kayak? And she was like, Darren, I love your enthusiasm, but if I'm honest, I think you kind of need to limit your kind of, you know, wheelchair basketball, wheelchair tennis, something with a bit more support. And in my head, anything that had the word wheelchair in it, I wasn't interested in, because I don't want to, you know, my wheelchair is my mode of transport and that's it. I don't want to prolong being in it. The sports that take my interest now are sports where you leave your chair at the side and you get in and you row or you kayak or you swim or whatever, that sense of freedom. So she was like, well, why are you asking? And I said, and I just got my phone out and showed her the picture of me sat next to my kayak. And she went, when was this? And I was like, it was yesterday, and that's mine. I just bought it. And she was like, Darren, you know, that typical like disapproving kind of the physio that wanted to take care of you, make sure you didn't kill yourself. But that was the single most important thing that I did in my injury, post-injury, because it was that statement to myself, and that once again reaffirming that commitment I made on the cliff that day, that I wouldn't be beaten. So on the 23rd of December, I'm discharged. On the 24th of December, I'm in the local swimming pool for 2 hours, and we've got our kayaks in the water. And I probably capsized, I don't know, 100 times in the space of 2 hours, because it turns out it is pretty difficult when you're kind of my injury level. But I wasn't deterred. With every capsize, with every failure, if you want to call it failure, I was more stubbornly determined to overcome the challenge.
Did you have to sort of adapt the kayak, because being sort of chest down in terms of your glutes and your waist being sort of supportive, did you have to sort of adjust it so it's more attached around your waist in a sense?
Yeah, you've got it. So we had to do it so it was a bit more padded, so it was a bit more connection to the boat. I had like a backrest, but the same as the one that, you know, my friends had. It wasn't any different to them. And that was the appeal, I think, in my mind, is once we were on the water, apart from the fact you could tell that one person looked a lot more tense than the rest, and that person was me, because I was trying not to fall in. And like, you use a lot of your neck muscles. So for me, with it being chest up, there's a lot of emphasis on neck muscles, on shoulder muscles to do the stability for you. So in a lot of the pictures from that day, you could just see the kind of like tension on my face. And but yeah, we didn't really do anything to it. So once we were off and we were paddling, you know, in the days that followed and the weeks that followed, it moved from a swimming pool to the local canal, and we'd leave my chair at the side, we'd jump in and we'd go down for a couple of miles and come back. And then, you know, a couple more weeks or months go past and we're up on one of the lakes in Wales near us in Snowdonia. And it was a real like sweet moment where I was looking back at kind of, you know, the journey I'd been on and thinking, well, I don't really know what's changed here. I've lost something, but I've gained something, and I'm not focusing on that. You could drive yourself crazy. You could completely torture yourself, and I could have tortured myself thinking about everything that I'd lost. But I just, my brain's not wired that way, and I know that it's not wired that way because that's self-protection. That's me looking after my mindset, and that's me looking after my kind of positivity. So it was much better, much more productive, and much more exciting to think about where this journey could go. And, you know, for me, that's, you know, something I'd tried a few things I'd never done before. I started rowing. I tried free diving, which is obviously, you know, scuba diving without the oxygen tank. Just take a breath and pull down on a rope, and, you know, before you know it, you're 30 foot under and you're swimming through a wreckage of a plane. And there were some of those moments. In that moment, as I was before I started to panic, I didn't have enough oxygen to get back to the surface. It was one of those, well, I never would have done this moments. My life was on two completely different trajectories, but what's to say that you can't achieve the same thing on this second trajectory? What's to say you can't achieve the same sense of fulfillment, happiness, challenge, excitement? And I was. And it's been the greatest adventure of my life has been life. My life has become one big adventure.
Oh, that's really well put. And with this sort of kayaking, doing that sort of probably weekends or something, was this where you got the idea to sort of kayak from John O'Groats to Land's End?
No, not at all. So the idea. So 6 months after coming out of hospital, so a year after my injury, I went for selection for Britain's Paralympic kayaking team. I kind of just thought, you know what, I've seen the leaflet, I'm going to go for it. I'm probably not what they're looking for, and God knows they didn't see kayaking ability in me, because the kayaks they use are a lot tippier. So I was upside down once again. This was back to the swimming pool day one type thing. This is in the lake in Nottingham at the National Water Sports Centre. And I'm upside down more times than I'm the right way up. And this poor coach is like dragging me out of the water. But with every capsize, I was like, put me back in. And he was like, well, you've fallen in about 4 times now. And I'm like, put me back in. So I think what they saw was like this stubborn determination and resilience and this kind of, willingness to overcome adversity. So they invited me back for a few more trials. And before I know it, life has become, I'm an athlete, and I'm driving over from Shrewsbury to Nottingham 3 days a week to the National Water Sports Centre, and I'm part of their talent development pathway. So they're looking at the next almost generation of athletes to challenge for Paralympic selection for Tokyo and for Paris and for the ones that follow that. And that's what life became. Life became moving towards my new purpose and my new goal, which was kayaking with the ambition of qualifying for Tokyo. And Kayak for Heroes didn't come about until I failed. I trained for 3 years for something, and before I can really do anything about it, I'm struggling with a shoulder injury. COVID comes in, double impact there. It throws everything, all the uncertainty of what's going to happen with the Olympics and the Paralympics. And 3 years of hard work looks like it might have no end result. And it was in that kind of flux, or that state of flux, where it was going back to controlling what I could control. And all of a sudden I can't control what's going to happen with the Paralympics, or whether or not I'll get a chance to qualify, and to be honest, whether or not my injury was holding me up enough that I could even be competitive. So in that, I think this would have been June 2020, I called up a couple of mates that I'd met through the Armed Forces Para Snow Sports team. We'd met Nordic skiing in Norway in December 2019. So I called them up, 3 or 4 months later, in the new year, and I said, do you guys fancy doing something epic? Do you fancy doing something really, really big? And the people I called, I knew were like-minded, and I knew that just saying that would kind of whet the appetite. And when we were in Norway, we sat around a table one night and we were having dinner, and we were chatting about big life goals. So Johnny, one of the lads on the table, said that he wanted to go to Antarctica. Luke was going to be running the World Marathon Challenge. So he was going to be running 7 marathons, 7 days, 7 continents. And we all went round, and it got to me. And I remember saying that for me, kayaking has been the single greatest discovery of my life post-injury, and the single greatest thing that I've really done. And I'd love to do something big expedition, big adventure. I'd love to, and I sort of threw it out there as a throwaway comment. I was like, I'd love to kayak from Land's End to John O'Groats. There wasn't any real rationale or logical thinking to why I said it. So when I called the guys up in 2020, in like I say, about June, and I was like, you fancy making it happen? Shall we do this? It's never been done it'd been done by 2 able-bodied paddlers, experienced sea kayakers. And here is a guy who's, got a serious high-level spinal injury, who has I'd never kayaked on the sea. I'd kayaked on rivers and lakes, and, I was doing the Paralympic stuff, but that's sprint kayaking. It's not kind of being off the coast and being offshore. And the 4 guys I was calling up, I knew full well weren't sea kayakers. I knew that Luke, his claim to, kayaking experience was 20 minutes on his honeymoon in Cancun on one of those big sit-on-top kayaks with his wife. But we all shared the same kind of mindset, that adapt and overcome mindset, and that willingness to take on a big challenge and just to figure it out. So before we know it, they've all said yes, and we're on our first Zoom call in the middle of lockdown number 1, and we're like, right, well, it was me leading it. It was me, just by the fact it was my idea, I'd become the expedition leader or team captain, and it was just a 12-month-long problem-solving process of, right, well, how do we acknowledge that we're all complete novice sea kayakers here, and B, how do we acknowledge that we've all got life-changing injury? So Ben had been shot 7 times in operations. Luke has stood on an ID in Afghanistan. Johnny had just commissioned out of Sandhurst, had a stroke, was paralysed down the left side of his body, and fought to kind of like rehabilitate his body, but was still left with a neurological impairment. Carl had a spinal injury as well. So there's 5 non-paddlers, probably me had done the most paddling, and 5 life-changing injuries, attempting to do something that had never been done by people, and never been done by team, and never been done by anybody with an injury or disability, had been done twice by real high-level, people that knew what they were doing. And, that's how Kayak for Heroes was formed. That was how the greatest achievement of my life kind of came into being. And when I told people at the local kayaking club down the road from me, quite a lot of experienced whitewater paddlers and sea paddlers, they were saying, well, I think initially they were like, A, you're mad, and B, when are you thinking of doing it? And I was like, well, next year. And it was that classic back to physio in hospital, roll of the eyes. And it was like, Darren, I wouldn't do this with any less than 3 years training. And I was like, 3 years? No, we're doing it next year. And there we go. Just like that, you've set your statement and you set your stall out to do something incredible.
I think when you decide on doing these, the longer you plan, the longer you train, while it's a good thing, and the more sort of you look at, the health and safety, the less likely you are to actually go and do it. Because if you weighed up all the sort of, health and safety aspects, or all the sort of problems that could go wrong, or all the logistics, eventually you just be like, oh, this is too complicated, we can't do this. Whereas if you go with that sort of slight sense of naivety and just that enthusiasm that you have, especially, then you can pretty much go out and things will go wrong. They always do, but by having that sort of drive and that enthusiasm for it, then I always think that's usually one of the best ways of going about it.
For sure. I think the expression that we use pretty much every day on the expedition was naive enough to start, stubborn enough to finish. That was like the mantra. That's like every time it got like a little bit shit or a little bit tough, we were like, lads, naive enough to start, and like someone else would be like, stubborn enough to finish. Like when everyone was cold and wet and tired, or it was like 4:30 in the morning, and that's when we had to start paddling because of the tide times. You were like cursing yourself. But we didn't know. We knew the kind of like the rough numbers. So I knew in that first Zoom call, I was like, right, lads, 1,400 kilometers. That's the distance. That's the rough distance. I reckon it'll take us 35 days. I reckon, we're going to be paddling on average 50 kilometers a day. I knew the numbers, because I'd like sat there and I'd mapped it, and I'd done. I didn't know anything about tide times or neap tides or spring tides. I was like educating myself. Like, honest to God, I bought, this will make you laugh, but I bought this book, which was like Sea Kayak. It was like, I actually bought a book called Sea Kayak because I was like, right, I need to know what we're doing. So it was educating myself, educating the team. But yeah, we didn't really know what we were letting ourselves into, really. And then as part of our 12-month build-up process, we brought on board a guy called Jim Taylor-Ross from Epic Kayaks, and he is probably one of the most experienced sea kayakers in the UK, and runs Great Britain's ocean paddling team. And it was him that kind of he was like, right, Daz, well, let's sit down and look over the map and look over your chosen route. And it was when we were looking over this map and over this route, he was like, right, I just want to point out a few things for you here. And he pointed out about 10 spots along this route. And each spot, the common theme was risk of death, risk of death, risk of death. So you had Mort Point, which in French means death. So it is quite affectionately known as Death Point. Doom Bar, the expression, the word doom being the key one there. There was one in Scotland called the Gulf of Corryvreckan. So people that know it will know it. And there's a whirlpool there, which is 10 meters wide. And if you get your timings wrong, there's a YouTube video of an RNLI lifeboat being pulled into it. And like the RNLI lifeboat is struggling to get out because the pull is that strong. And he said to me, he was like, Daz, if you get this wrong, if you get this timing wrong, you will be dragged into that, sucked down and spat out 10 miles offshore in the Irish Sea, dead. And like, it wasn't much of a morale booster, like his chat about these 10 places, but it definitely gave me a better understanding of the kind of, I guess, the level of severity of the challenge and the kind of serious nature of it. Not that we weren't taking it seriously, but like we say, in naivety, there is a little bit of, naivety, perhaps.
Yeah, I suppose it's also mitigating the sort of big risks and looking into that. I mean, you sort of, as you say, it's good to go with a sense of naivety, but when doing, especially by sea, you definitely want to know exactly where you can mitigate risk. Yeah,
for sure. And we did that. So we kind of, the plan evolved week by week. Initially, it was going to be, right, we're doing this, no safety boat. We're just going to be, doing it on our own, proving. And it was that, I think there was that stubbornness and that perhaps overcompensation of someone with a injury trying to prove that there's no limits kind of thing. But as we brought Jim on and we learnt more about what we were actually taking on, the kind of the real like seriousness of this challenge, we made like those mitigations. So we introduced a safety boat kind of thing, and we knew that we'd have a safety boat there if anything went wrong. And thank God we did, because there were days where things did go wrong, and if we didn't have the safety boat there, it would have been a completely different scenario. And we knew that to mitigate some of the risks of coastal paddling, we used the expression that deep water is our friend, and by that we meant that we did the majority of our paddling 5k offshore. So we were 5 kilometers, away from the cliffs, 5 kilometers away from tidal races that could really, screw us over if we got it wrong. So whilst all of a sudden you feel like a very small object in a massive sea of blue with waves and swell, we were a safe distance away from the towering cliffs that, the Cornish coastline is shipwreck coastline for a reason. It's got a history of, catching people out. So we kind of thought that the safest thing to do, working with Jim to formulate the plan, was to stay deep and stay as far away from the cliffs as we could, without going too far into the Atlantic Ocean, obviously.
And on that journey, were you, because you've got, where were you sort of staying? Were you sleeping in B&Bs? Were you wild camping?
So we were all prepared. I was up for camping. I thought this would be brilliant, but
on the beach.
Yeah. The reality of it was, I think, the attrition rate of our bodies, and especially like everybody's injuries flared up in different ways. So mine, pressure sores were actually the biggest thing for me. So when you can't feel your bum and you sat down for long periods, salt water, sweat, rub, you do really need to keep on top of it. Because for me, I was petrified that within the first week I'd have a pressure sore, and that would be me off the expedition. Johnny, the kind of like knock-on effects of his stroke have been that when he's cold, wet and tired, his body starts to shut down. Neurologically, his body shuts down, and we saw it happen. So from an accommodation point of view, we made, we kind of put those like mitigations in place where we actually would treat ourselves. So we had the luxury of Travelodge supporting us, and we kind of used some of the Travelodge accommodation up the country just to get a warm bed, a hot shower. Admittedly, we weren't in some of these beds for very long, because by the time we'd got off the water, got our kit sorted, planned for the next day, gone through a team briefing, by the time like I'd led the briefing and then done the planning for the next day, I might not be getting my head down till 11, and then we might be up at 4 because we're on the water at 5. So it was a lot of quick turnarounds, but yeah, I think having somewhere to have a warm shower and get our heads down, and just to appreciate the fact that we weren't 5 grizzly paddlers. We were 5 guys trying to push themselves so far out of their comfort zone and achieve something that had never been done before. And we were trying to make a statement for what people with disabilities can achieve. And there aren't many people in the adventure community that have got disabilities. There's just, there's not many of us, kind of thing. So we were doing it. We were flying the flag for, injury and disability adventurers, really.
Wow. And where have you sort of come in at? How long did the sort of expedition take?
So we banked on 35, right? And we banked on 50 kilometers a day. And then day 1, we hit 50 and we were like, sweet, it can be done. We can do this. And then day 2, we hit 55 and we were like, damn, we're getting good at this, and the process and the machine, we were getting slicker at our drills in terms of just our timings on and off the water. Day 1, within 10 minutes of paddling, I capsized, and in my head, that like voice of the inner critic that we all have in the back of our heads was going overtime, because I was, I was feeling the pressure of leading it. I was feeling the pressure of showing that I was a competent, confident paddler, and 10 minutes in, I'm upside down, and the safety boat is kind of coming in, and it's like, right, Dad, should we get you out? So we were in double kayaks, and I turned it back up, and I was like, no, we're getting back in. So like, it took 3 attempts to drag myself back onto the cockpit and to get my legs in. First 2 occasions, we flopped back out the other side, but I was just so determined to prove that we could do it. And so for me personally, every day was a struggle, but those first couple of days, with each day I got more confident and more relaxed, which is a huge bit of paddling and dealing with the waves. I was trying to fight every wave and try and fight every bit of swell. So I think as we all went through that process, the first day we were all nervous. People were seasick. If people weren't seasick, the other person was throwing up because you were next to somebody who was seasick. There was sick and puke, and there was other stuff as well. But with each day that went, we ended up clocking up more miles, and we were hitting about 60, 65 kilometers a day. We were extending our paddling window to about 8 hours on the water, 8 hours of physical paddling. So I think a week in, we were 3 days ahead of schedule. And we said to ourselves that we'd make the decision that we'd only have days off if weather meant that we couldn't physically paddle, or we could just see it on ourselves. If we needed a day, we weren't going to torture ourselves, and we could see when everybody was struggling. So we did have a couple of days. And before we know it, it's day 25 and we're at the northeast coast of Scotland, and we're 1 day from John O'Groats. And I mean, I know that I've just condensed 26 days of expedition into about 30 seconds there, but we were absolutely like flying as a team, and we were learning to not try and fight the weather and fight the wind, fight the waves. We were learning to run with the waves. And there were days where, your average paddling speed is probably 8 kilometers an hour. And there were days where we were catching waves and we were surging at like 20 kilometers an hour. And there were days where I felt like I was getting thrown out the back of the kayak, and my backrest was like fully strained. And I was like riding this wave and screaming as we were doing it and just having the time of our lives. And there were a couple of days where we hit 100-kilometer days. We were paddling for 11 hours and we were just like, right, everything is perfect. Everything is going our way. Let's keep paddling. Let's try and like maximize progress as much as we could. Because there were days where things didn't go well. There were a couple of days where things really could have gone wrong. And, we had to make a decision to cut things short. There was one day where an idea of mine was that instead of following the coastline round northeast England into the southwest of Scotland, we could straight line it from the coast of the Lake District all the way to southwest Scotland to a place called Kirkcudbright, which is not how you pronounce it, as the Scottish kind of corrected us when we were there, but I don't want to try and say it properly because I'll mess it up even more. But what we had was an 80-kilometre crossing across the Irish Sea that could save us 3 days worth of paddling. So it was one punchy, ambitious day. And it was a calculated risk, but in my head I was like, we should do this, and we can do this. With the safety boat, we can do it. So we're in the middle of the crossing, about 40 kilometres in, and we're in the middle of the Irish Sea. And visibility's okay, not great, but over the course of the day, we're about halfway through the day, halfway there, the visibility is dropping, and you can just see it minute by minute coming closer to the point where we're probably down to about 10 meter visibility, sea mist. And all of a sudden we've got no awareness if there's ferries crossing, because it's the middle of a busy shipping lane. And there was a decision to be made as to whether this was safe anymore. We're using the safety boat as the kind of point of reference. So the safety boat's ahead of the kayak and it's trailing the safety boat. And because we had 5 paddlers with 4 paddling seats, we were rotating like who the paddlers were for the days. So myself, I'm on the safety boat at this point, and I'm sat next to Chris, who's our rib driver, safety boat driver, and Jim's behind me, who's a safety advisor, like I said. And we're looking at the screen in front, and we're trying to make a decision as to what do we do. You know, if we were to cut and run now, where are we going? Because we're 40k from Belfast, 40k from here, 40k from there. And it was while we were looking at the screen, we'd lost, awareness of what was going on behind us. And it wasn't until I think one of us turned round, and we turned round just to see a wall of grey, wall of mist, no boat, no kayak. So I jumped on the radio and I was like, Darren, Luke, mate, can you see the boat? And just gave it a couple of seconds, nothing came back. And I was like, okay. And I was like, Darren, Luke, Darren, Carl, mate, just comms check. Can you let us know you can hear me? And all I was expecting back was like, yep, can hear you, or just any indication that they could hear us, because we didn't have visibility on them, we couldn't hear them, and we couldn't communicate with them. And as the seconds ticked by and the minutes started to tick by, we cut the engine on the boat and we just sat and waited and thought, if we sit here, they'll physically catch up with us and we'll see them. And then the minutes started to tick by, and we're probably about 15 minutes in now, and panic. I'm feeling a huge weight of pressure at this point, because we've got a boat missing in the middle of the Irish Sea, and a lot of things could happen here. A lot of scenarios could unfold, and we can't control them. So we end up turning the boat round, going back down our previous line, and we go back for about 5 minutes, just thinking that maybe they've capsized and we'll happen to pick them up, and nothing. And we're trying to, the whole time, trying to get in comms with them on the radios, nothing. And we're just really deciding, right, what is the next line of escalation here? What do we do now? Jim's got his thoughts, Chris has got his thoughts, and we need to make a decision. And just through pure good fortune, as we're coming back up to where we cut the engines originally, we see a really faint grey kind of like blob of haze coming through, and we bomb it over, and it's Carl and Luke, and we're like, so relieved. They didn't know we were trying to get in contact with them. I was like, lads, were you not getting anything I was sending through? And they were like, no. And as far as they were concerned, they thought that they just lost us slightly, and they were following us through the mist. They had no idea. But what they'd done, a bit like when you walk in a desert, you've got one dominant foot, they'd veered off left, and we'd only seen them again because they were so disoriented in the mist. They'd done a full loop, and we happened to intersect them at the point where they'd come back on our line. And had that not happened, had they not done a full loop, had they just done a kind of a slow veer, they could have ended up, in, degrading conditions in the middle of the Irish Sea, and God knows what could have happened, sort of thing. So there were a couple of days where things were less than ideal, stressful. By the time we got back to shore, back to a port, there was like a huge sigh of relief. And then there were days where everything went brilliant, and we were cruising, families of dolphins swimming alongside the kayaks. And there were moments where there was one day when we were paddling through one of the locks in the northwest of Scotland, and I was like really pushing myself to keep the speed up, and I was just in the zone. I was in my element. And as we were paddling, there was just this real lovely realization that nothing in my life had changed. I was still exactly the same person I was the day before my accident to 4.5 years later. And I think it was the first time I really felt it in my heart. I really kind of, wasn't just telling myself that I was still the same person. I knew I was. I had this real warm, like fuzzy feeling. That sounds a little bit kind of cliche, but that nothing had changed, that I'd never lost my sense of identity, because I was still the same version of me, pushing my limits, doing stuff that was adventurous, and being outdoors.
What a story! It's just an incredible sort of feat of, you guys going out and sort of showing that there's no limits to what you can achieve, and no matter what happens to you in life, whatever tries to sort of bring you down, you can always sort of rise up and, achieve whatever you sort of set your mind to it. You have this sort of very strong positive mindset and, this sort of growth mindset in a sense. I imagine you probably had that even before your accident, but even now, is this hugely important to you?
Yeah, for sure. And I think it's something that we're all born with. I think we all have this innate ability to be resilient. But much like any other muscle in our body, you can train it, and you train it by failing, and you train it by trying. You don't always have to achieve, like for me, not achieving my kind of like goal of qualifying for the Paralympics was a failure, and it was a huge failure, and it was hard to take at the time, but off the back of it, I learned and I put into action what the momentum I built up over 3 years into something that would be my greatest achievement. And I think if we're not resilient, our first failure is often our last failure, because you then don't put yourself into some of the most resilient people I've met are kids. And it's because kids aren't scared of trying and failing. Kids, as you're in that kind of phase of your life, you're constantly learning to ride a bike, falling off, learning to ride a bike, falling off a little bit less. And you're constantly doing things for the first time, and doing things for the first time often means not being great at them. And then we become an adult, and a lot of us get into our comfort zone, and we know that we can play tennis to a certain level, play football to a certain level. So we stay at that, and we don't push ourselves out of our comfort zone. So I think I was so fortunate that in the build up to my accident, I'd embraced failing. And, everybody that rock climbs or mountaineers will agree that the first time you try something is not often the time that you succeed or it goes as well as possible. You have to learn to overcome a particular crux of a move or particular pitch of a climb or whatever it might be. And I just took that same mindset into my injury and kind of, accepted that I'm going to be doing a lot of things for the first time again now. And that is still very much the mindset I live with. And I've learned to not be scared of failure. I've learned to control the voice of doubt in my own head. I think everybody is their own worst critic. And I don't think you can ever turn that off. I've never been able to turn that voice in the back of my head off. And like I say, day one of the expedition, capsizing 10 minutes in, that voice was very much in full force, because it was trying to say, told you, you can't do this. Somebody, this hasn't been done by someone like you before, because it can't be done. And I've just learned to say, cheers, but I disagree, and almost to enjoy proving it wrong, and to kind of say, well, I'll tell you what, I'll show you. So I think being resilient has been the biggest asset to me, overcoming a life-changing injury and being able to achieve the things that I'm setting myself out to do. And the thing with the expedition, we didn't even know, there was no guarantees we were going to succeed. So we could be having this conversation today, and I could say to you that on day 20, we had to cancel it because we were at our limits and we couldn't achieve it. But I know that because I'm a resilient person and I have a resilient mindset, I wouldn't let the failure of the expedition dent any future plans.
Yeah, I sort of agree. It's and that probably led quite nicely to your next expedition that's happening next year, or what you're training for at the moment. For people listening, what are you aiming to achieve from it?
So off the back of the kayaking expedition, a couple of doors opened, and one of which was to do the World Marathon Challenge. So for those of you that don't know, that's to run 7 marathons in 7 days on 7 different continents. So the first one being in Antarctica, and then you bounce day 1 from Antarctica, day 2 South Africa, day 3 Perth, Australia, and you bounce from continent to continent, and you do 7 marathons in 7 days. Now, less people have done this than have climbed Everest. I think the number that have done the World Marathon Challenges is like 180. So it's kind of, it's got that exclusivity, which is always kind of, sounds quite good. And importantly for me, it's never been done by anybody with in a wheelchair. It's never been done unsupported by anybody with a disability. So there's another kind of nice element here of being able to prove what someone with a disability can achieve. Now, I'm not entirely sure how a wheelchair plus snow and ice is going to work in Antarctica, so I'll let you know. Could still be stuck there like 20 hours later, but I'm pretty sure I'll get myself around the marathon distance. But so that will be it was originally scheduled for February 2022. Because of COVID, it's now been pushed back to November. So I will throw myself wholeheartedly into lots and lots and lots of miles in the wheelchair in the new year. And another one, close to my heart, which will be earlier in the year, will be in May, will be to row the English Channel in memory of my father, who died in September this year. He'd struggled with mental health for a good couple of years, and COVID really, really, really impacted him, as it did a lot of people. And he sadly took his own life in September this year. So I kind of wanted to do something that would be in memory of him and could be a way of raising money for the mental health charities that supported him towards the end. So I think trying to, control what I can control and do something positive from what is a negative, to be resilient to, the passing of my dad, and to do something in his memory. So we're going to be rowing the channel, and I've put together a team of 8 people that have each gone through their own mental health journeys, that have lost people as a result of mental health, or have gone through that themselves and pulled themselves back from the brink. So we're going to be, in May 2022, rowing the channel for mental health charities, and going for the world record time, of course, which is 3 hours 51 currently. So we're going to go for 3 hours 50. That is the joke, but I am semi-serious about it as well. And that's the first thing, and that's a real personal one for me for next year. It's got a real emotional connection to the adventure. So it's adventure with a real purpose of celebrating the life of my dad, and also helping others to hopefully make sure that people get the help they need, and they don't end up in that position, because mental health is tough.
Well, hopefully you can use that drive to get the world record.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, every stroke will be with a bit more vigor because of that.
Yeah, well, I'm so sorry to hear that. As I say, mental health is definitely something which affects. I don't know anyone who hasn't known someone or themselves is not affected by it. And it's probably in the last few years, with everything that's going on, almost become worse and worse.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think it, to use the analogy of filling up a glass of water, you've got your third of your cup full because of work stress, a third of your cup full because of financial pressures, and then doesn't take much more to keep adding to that glass before you're overflowing. And if you don't know how to deal with that, or you don't have the support network to help you deal with that, it can seem quite desperate. And for people like my dad, I know that his mental health meant that he saw himself as a I don't know, it's still a bit raw to talk about, I guess, but he saw himself as a drain, and he saw himself as almost like a liability because of the way he was feeling. So yeah, tricky one to talk about. But
well, I think it's very exciting about this these sort of adventures that you're doing, and as I say, hopefully everyone listening can sort of follow along and support it. Yeah, I mean, it's been such a pleasure listening to your stories, and as you say, you speak so well and so passionately about overcoming adversity in the last sort of 5 years with everything that's gone on. And Yeah, so I mean, there's a part of the show where we ask the same 5 questions to each guest each week. With the first being on, your trip and adventures. What's the one gadget that you always take with you?
GoPro.
GoPro?
Yeah, got to. We had one of the 360 ones on the front of the kayak for the expedition. It was good. It was a little bit of a novelty purchase, I guess, but yeah, some of the footage that we got, from that, I think, and so much of, I'm so rubbish at self-promotion, I'm so rubbish at social media, but you kind of, in the modern world, you have to capture it to prove you've done it and to spread the word, and especially when you're trying to achieve something bigger than yourself. So when we were trying to champion what injury and disability meant in terms of the limits that you don't have, we had to document the thing to prove and to kind of put people up there to show, what could be achieved if you've just had a stroke like Johnny did 5 years ago or whatever it might be, or you have some form of life-changing injury. So yeah, so some way of documenting the adventures, I think, is the answer to that one.
What about your favorite adventure or travel book?
Before the film came out, I'd read Beyond Possible by Nims, 14 Peaks, which is obviously was then turned into 14 Peaks on Netflix. So I read that book when it first came out and was in awe of that. I know it's probably a bit of a popular choice at the moment, but that book really inspired me, and I read that before we went on the expedition. So the whole idea of nothing is impossible, I think, stuck in my brain for the duration of the expedition.
Why are adventures important to you?
I think there's so many bits to this, isn't there? I think for me, adventure is like a way of life, and I'm sure you share that, and everybody that listens share that. It's just a way that we want to live our lives, and it's a way of living a fulfilling life. And for me, it ticks both boxes of physical and emotional maintenance and recovery. So for me, I'm still very much going through my physical recovery. I know it's 5 years after my accident, but I'm still getting myself to where I want to be. So adventure gives me that, and it gives me those emotional and psychological ticks in the box that mountaineering and climbing used to do. So I think the biggest tragedy of my injury would have been letting it stop me living an adventurous life. That would have been the real trauma. That would have been the real loss. So not losing that has been the most beautiful kind of positive from my accident. So adventure has been a part of my life since I was 17 and continues to be, despite being disabled. I'll say that with the old, funny years, but.
Yeah, I saw the video that you put up of you walking up the steps the other day, which I imagine was a huge win.
Yeah, so steps become like your mortal enemy when you're in a wheelchair, because there might be 2 steps into somewhere and you're cursing yourself. But I'll generally throw myself on the floor and get up the stairs if I want to. If the reward is worth the effort, I'll still do it. But I'm incredibly fortunate enough to have something called a rewalk exoskeleton, which is a very futuristic robot that you strap to your body, and it comes up to just below my ribs, and you can walk again, and you learn to walk by moving your body weight, and the robot and the exoskeleton reads what you're trying to do. So you have to try and walk. It sounds a bit bizarre to say that when you can't move your legs, but you have to try and imitate the way that you would shift your body balance, and it replicates the movement and walks for you. And it has a stair setting, which I've not been brave enough to try for about 2 years because I've just had visions of another fall. I'm kind of done with falling now, but I kind of built up the courage to give it a go. And yeah, only 2 weeks ago, I was stood at the foot of a staircase in the local leisure centre with the physio behind me, and started climbing the stairs for the first time in 5 years. And it wasn't until we were halfway up, and then he was like, "Right, should we turn around and go back down?" And I turned around to go back down, and oh my God, I had the shock of my life. I was like, the stairs used to look this scary. The stairs always look like this. And going up was fine. So I'm going to I've made a throwaway comment to my partner that's a joke and serious at the same time, that in next year I'd like to see if I can climb the shard in the legs, do the staircase, because I think that'd be quite a powerful thing, and do that for charity as well. Yeah, yet to find out if that's feasible at all, but I'll throw it out there into the universe and hopefully we'll make it happen.
I'm sure. Well, I will happily join you in that one if you need some company.
I'll hold you to that.
I hope so. What about your favourite quote?
So it's by Stephen King, and it's you can, you should, and you will. So
very nice.
A motto to live by if you ever have an idea. So climbing the shard, you can, you should, and you will. So it's an awful thing to say though, because you just get yourself into so many different kind of things. Every time I have an idea and I say that quote in my head, I'm like, oh damn, got to do it now then.
Say yes a bit more.
Say yes a bit more, yeah.
Yeah. People listening are always keen to travel and go on these grand adventures. What's the one thing you would recommend for people wanting to get started?
Ooh, I think not to be daunted by not to be afraid of starting with something small. When you kind of set yourself a huge challenge, the ultimate goal can look quite scary. So if you're on day one of something and you think, I've got 35 days of this, it suddenly becomes a lot more daunting than if you break it down into your smaller segments and you kind of like compartmentalize it a little bit. So for me, my adventures to start with, when I was living my new chapter of life, would look so mundane now. Like kayaking around a swimming pool was the epitome of adventure for day one of my life post-hospital. Whereas if I was to go and do that now, I'd be bored. I'd go and do laps around the pool and be like, right, sweet, should we go and do something else, kind of thing. So not to be put off by making a small statement and letting that small statement be, what was the expression? The hardest step is often the first. Is that it?
It's taking the first step, basically.
Yeah, it's often the hardest step. So not to be, and a lot of people do like these couch to 5Ks and stuff, don't they? And probably the scariest part of a couch to 5K for someone that's never run before or hasn't, perhaps looked after their physical fitness is that very first run. So if you want to be adventurous and live an adventurous life, start small and grow from there. Don't try and do something like kayaking from Land's End to John O'Groats before you've kayaked in the local swimming pool is the takeaway there.
Yeah, and I imagine for anyone who does the sort of couch to 5K, if you can get past the first one and manage to go for the second run, because even like myself, nothing worse than when you haven't done anything for a month or two and then go on this run and you're like almost having a heart attack, almost, grabbing every bit of oxygen you can. And yeah, so it is just taking those small steps that make a huge difference. And finally, what are you doing now and how can people find you and follow you when you next go on this big adventure?
Yeah, so a couple of things, I guess. Website, first one, www.darrenedwards.org.uk, because .com and .co.uk were taken, sadly. So .org.uk seemed like the next best thing. On Instagram, Darren Edwards _adventurer. Same on Facebook. And yeah, I will, despite being rubbish at social media, attempt to keep all of those up to date as much as possible.
Well, we'll put a link of them in the description below so you can follow him. And God, it has just been such a pleasure listening to your stories, Darren. And I cannot thank you enough for coming on today. And please, go check them out. And yeah, we look forward to following your big adventure in the future.
Yeah. Thank you, John.